Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 11th episode of my new podcast, Pug Fireball and Company. My guest today is author Tim Grover, who has written a new book about Babe Ruth's barnstorming tour in Iowa and other states after the 1922 season. It's called Barnstorming Babe, a slugger's bumpy trek across small-town America. Good afternoon, Tim. Please share with us where you are from and where you went to school.
Hey, Steve. Thank you, first of all, for having me on here. It's an honor anytime anybody wants to hear about my book. I live in Pleasant Hill, Iowa, and grew up in Northeast Iowa around Independence area, attended Iowa Central Community College in Fort Dodge for broadcasting, and then a few years later went to UNI with a major in broadcasting and journalism minor. Worked a lot of different jobs in radio, TV production, sales, and whatnot. In 1985, I started working for a mobile DJ company called Complete Music in Des Moines. And then my wife wound up buying it's actually a franchise based out of Omaha. We built that up to the point where we could do up to 10 different dances at one time. So that was insane for a while. We owned that for about 25 years and
Wow.
sold it in 2013 after we did about 7,000 events. So, and then I did a couple other things after we sold it. Worked for Mediacom, selling business internet for a while. And then my last full-time job was working for Unity Point at Home, delivering home medical equipment. So a lot of crazy job experiences. So when people say, well, what did you do before you retired? I'm like, lots of stuff.
There's probably not a song you haven't heard of. If you were doing
Yeah. Got pretty tired of playing some of those saying, I love Bob Seger, but man, I could live without hearing old time rock and roll again, those cliche songs. But
what inspired you to write this book?
I have always loved baseball, especially baseball history. I kind of sucked as a player, did not make it past the Little League. I wanted to be the next Harmon Killebrew, but that's why I got my Twins shirt on right here. But I figured out fairly quickly that the only thing I had in common with him was we both struck out a lot and we're both pretty slow. So, but so loved history and I got a book. I think it's a guy named Bill Jenkinson that wrote it called The Year Babe Ruth Hit 108 Home Runs. And I'm like, okay, that title intrigued me. And he went back and chronicled every single home run that Babe Ruth hit, whether it was regular season, World Series, exhibition, barnstorming games, all of that. In reading that, I found out that Babe actually came and played in Iowa like 3 or 4 different times. And 1922, his very first trip to the Midwest, doing any barnstorming, the trip started in Perry, Iowa, which is about 45 minutes away from where I live. So I'm like, what was he doing in a town of 5,000 people? Then from there, I wanted to catalog, right, about all the different other times that he played in Iowa. But it's like in 22, then he played after Perry, he went to Lincoln and Omaha, but then he played in Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, and then Sioux City, Iowa. It's like, how do you go from Perry to Sioux City without including Sleepy Eye, Minnesota? What's the story there? About half of the towns that he played in 1922 were less than 10,000 people. That was kind of what hooked me, is like what brought him to those places and what were the reactions of the local people when seeing a big league baseball start. He wasn't the huge hero guy that we think of now. He was about a third of the way into his career. It was like a year or two after he had gone into batting full time instead of also pitching. He wasn't quite the legend that we know him as now, but so Yeah,
What
lots of
sources did
research.
you what sources did you use?
Yeah, several different books. Jane, can't think of her name. She wrote one called The Big Fella,
Oh yeah,
and that
I read that.
I didn't even find that book till I was pretty much done with mine. She kind of talks about the 1927 barnstorming tour that he took, and includes Des Moines in that one, I
Mm-hmm.
think. But so that gave me a lot of background on Babe. It was her book was about the tour, but as kind of a structure for throwing in more about his life, his upbringing, the things that he did while he was playing during regular season. Newspapers.com was an amazing source. It's a subscription service. I think $20 a month. You can subscribe to it, and it gives you access to a lot of these old newspapers that especially for these little county towns, places. I mean, Pratt, Kansas, where do you find information about Babe Ruth going there and playing? Well, newspapers.com. I also watched the Ken Burns baseball documentary again, and that kind of helped give me a feel for what the times were like back then too, and kind of Babe's impact on the game.
Did you go to any of these towns? Like you said, Perry's fairly close. Did you go to their libraries or anything and do research at the towns?
I got I met with a guy who had some history on Perry. He knew some people, shared some stories. He's actually can't remember his name, but the Dexter Library in Dallas County. Met with him there. He had some pictures and some articles. Other than that, I have not been to some of these places. My I guess my bucket list for a tour thing would be Sleepy Eye,
Yeah.
Minnesota, because they still have the field there where he played
Oh.
at, and they've got a museum, historical museum with some stuff. Um, I had reached out to them. I got permission, I think, to use one of their pictures, and wanted to follow up too with them on some other things, but they never got back to me. But I had a lot of other stuff to kind of work through as well. One of my favorite stories actually involves Sleepy Eye. There was a kid there. I'll just read it from the book if that's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
There was a guy named Len Youngman, and he died in 2018 in Virginia, Minnesota, which is way up in the Iron Range. He was 107 years old, and it was the
Wow.
96th anniversary of the Sleepy Eye baseball game. Len was there. He was playing outside the park. Didn't know if he didn't have the money to get in there or what. Playing with some buddies. Heard a loud crash of the ball, and he looked down, and there's a ball rolling right to him. Said it went right over the center fielder's head. Didn't even chase it. So there must not have been a fence there, but it rolled right to his feet, and it was a home run hit by Babe Ruth. His grandson, then Joel Youngman, inherited the prized baseball 2016. And he got hold of the Sleepy Eye Area Historical Society and told about his grandpa. And, then there were several baseball historians, local ones there, that got real intrigued about that. They went up to visit Len with his grandson. So again, Len at the time was, 100 and some years old. They took along a newspaper reporter named Blake Huppert from KARE Channel 11 in the Twin Cities. And Len said, can't imagine anybody coming this far just to see a baseball. He said he forgot to ask Babe Ruth to autograph it for him. Ooh,
Yes.
man. But there's a picture that day of Babe Ruth and Bob Musial. Bob was the other outfielder for the Yankees that traveled with Babe Ruth. Typically, Babe would play for the hometown team, and Bob would play for the visiting team. So, like when they played in Perry, Babe played for the Perry team. Bob played for the Pella Meteors. Okay.
Oh.
So, anyway, there's a picture of Bob and Babe standing and freezing. And there was like sleet that day and sleepy eye. It didn't look like they were too happy playing there. But um, there's in that picture, let's describe it the way that I wrote it. Bob Musil wears a full-length overcoat with his hands in the pockets. Babe wears a white woolen Yankee sweater in dark trim, missing a button, and neither is smiling. They stand in front of a chicken wire backstop, about 20 men in the bleachers behind them, and there's 8 other men huddled behind the players on the field. Sneaking into the photo was a precocious lad sporting a newsboy cap. He peers out from behind Musil's left elbow, and only his head is visible. As the shutter snapped, 11-year-old Len Youngman photobombed the Bronx Bombers.
Oh,
There's
there he
a picture
is.
right there. See that little dude?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I love that story. And those are just some of the cool things that I found in researching for the book and everything.
You've kind of answered this, I guess, but how did you acquire the photos? Or there
Yeah,
were
I
any
got
other ways you got photos?
just somewhere wiki, Wikipedia, common. I worked with Book Press Publishing in Des Moines, Tony Postion, and so he made working with a publisher like that. He wants to make sure all the, T's are crossed, the I's are dotted, all of that good stuff. So I did secure permission from different historical museums to use some of the pictures that they had. Like the Pella Historical Museum, I got an incredible picture of the Pelotown team. One in Denver that I got, a few other Deadwood, South Dakota. I got some stuff from them from the museums that had given me permission to use their stuff, and they might say, "Hey, kind of $20 or whatever." So, but
Yeah,
the rest off the internet.
I've found that historical museums can really be very helpful, and they're usually very glad to help you. How long did it take to produce the manuscript for the book? How long did it take to actually write it? And you probably went through more than one draft.
Oh boy. You know how that goes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I started maybe about 10 years ago when I had first found out about him doing this, and then doing some research at the historical building, Iowa Historical Museum, doing some microfilm stuff, and my eyes blurry from that. And then I kind of set that aside because I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. I'd done some freelance writing and stuff before, so it's like, is this going to be a magazine article or what? And then set that aside for a while, then started getting back more into it. And then I got laid off from my job at MediaCom in September of 2020. And I'm like, okay, it's time to get serious about this. I've got the time. Basically, I had a year off before I went to work for Unity Point, and that gave me the time to really focus in and get the research done. And I guess even during that time, there was a while where it's like you get 2/3 of the way through the book, and then you're like, I'm tired of this. So you just type up some stuff and you just throw it against the wall, and then you set that aside, and then you come back to it and go, I mean, even when you're writing it, you know that this part kind of sucks. It needs to be better. I think for writers, if you set aside some of that stuff sometimes and you come back to it, it gives you a whole new appreciation and more ambition to get it done and, make it be good. But there were probably 4 or 5 drafts, I suppose, before it was all ready for publication. And the great thing about Book Press, too, was that they did have the editors that were very helpful with that stuff, too. Sometimes you're too close to your work and you don't realize something that's in there that doesn't necessarily move the story forward, or there's things that you want to say, but you just don't know quite how to put it out there on paper, and it's awkward, and the editor comes and goes, bam. You're like, well, yeah, book came out then in January of 2023, and sold about 650 copies so far. So I'm very, very pleased with that.
So, when did the tour begin exactly, and when did it end?
Started in October 13th of 1922, and there's quite a backstory leading up to that too, because there for a long time baseball players had done barnstorming exhibition tours to supplement their income, because the ownership, ball players were not getting paid nearly as much as they are now. There's some guys that are probably going up in it one at bat making more than some career players made in their whole lifetime.
Yeah.
Literally. But so there was also, we're talking like in the 1915s era, they had established a rule baseball had that players who had been involved in the World Series were not allowed to do any barnstorming after the season. Rationale for Major League Baseball was that you're World Series champion and some little team in Des Moines beats you. It makes Major League Baseball look really stupid. I guess there's a bit of a rationale there, but be the crappiest player on the crappiest team and still go out and barnstorm, which doesn't make any sense either. Anyway, that rule had not been enforced very much at all. And then in 1919, there was a thing called the Chicago Black Sox, or the World Series. Basically, had been thrown by some Chicago White Sox players. Not very good for baseball. All the owners were freaking out, and they wanted to clean up the game and protect their financial interests. So they hired a guy named Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and he was pretty hardcore. Even though the guys that were involved in the Black Sox scandal they were acquitted by a Chicago jury, Landis told him they were still banished from baseball forever. That's where you get the whole story about Shoeless Joe Jackson, Field of Dreams, all that stuff. But he also told World Series players that they could not go out and do the barnstorming thing like they kind of had been doing, because that rule had not been enforced. After the 1921 World Series, which the Yankees lost to the New York Giants, Babe Ruth and Bob Musial decided they wanted to go out and do some barnstorming in the Northeast. And Landis said, no, you can't do that. That's not advisable. Babe Ruth said, well, I'm pretty much Babe frickin' Ruth. I can do what I want to. And so a little clash of egos there. They played about 3 or 4 games, and then the heat kind of came down from Yankee ownership and management and Landis, and they suspended the tour. And Landis took away their World Series bonus money, which I think was around $5,000, $5,500, something like that. And he suspended them for the first 6 weeks of the 1922 baseball season. That all kind of led into the 1922 season for those guys. They didn't wind up playing until, I think it's kind of funny too about the cover of my book. It shows, you're looking at it backwards, aren't you? That's Babe Ruth, Bob Musial, and that scrawny looking guy in the middle is Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis. That picture was taken at spring training in 1922. Landis and Musial were allowed to participate in spring training, but beginning of the season, then they had to sit it out for 6 weeks. When Ruth finally got in and played, he slumped, did not do very well. He kind of copped an attitude, kicked dirt on umpires, swore, different things like that. Basically, he wound up getting suspended for a third of the games in 1922. So, I mean, still had a solid year as far as like batting and all that stuff. And the Yankees did go to the World Series again, got beat again by the New York Giants, and Babe only batted like 118 in that series, so he sucked big time. He and Musial wanted to do the barnstorming thing again, and I don't know if Landis actually found a place in his heart for redemption for those guys, but he said, "Okay, y'all can go do some barnstorming." So they were happy. They headed out of New York right after the World Series and took a train to Perry, Iowa. That's when it started, and it ended in Denver, I think right before Halloween, so October 29th or 30th, something like that. They played 18 games in 17 days, all traveling by train. It wasn't like hopping on nice Amtrak train these days. It was clunkety. Babe said that he referred to some of the trips as jerkwater railroads. And one time, or after the tour, he was back in New York. Reporters were asking him about it. He said, "Felt like we were traveling on square wheels." So kind of, they were all day games, and so they were sometimes doing overnight trips and not sleeping very well. They had one stretch where they went from Sioux City to Deadwood, South Dakota, out in the Black Hills. The following day, they were down playing in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, which is way out the Nebraska Panhandle, kind of not far from Wyoming. And then they came all the way across Nebraska to Tarkio, Missouri, the far northwest corner of Missouri, and played that next day. It was like 13 or 1400 miles in 4 days. Basically, they traveled. And so that was pretty insane for them, I think.
Well, what was the weather like most of these days? Because you're in the fall now by the time you get to the Midwest, especially out in Denver. Did they run into any snow at any point?
That was where yeah, and I don't know that they made any money at all on this tour. If they did, it was pretty marginal, and they got hurt by it. Rained in Kansas City on the Sunday that they were playing there against the Kansas City Monarchs, and some cool stories there. Also snowed in Denver then, and other yeah. So they got hit by nasty weather in two of the bigger markets that they would have played in, the biggest markets they would have played in. And so that definitely kept people away. Even the Perry game, they were hoping to sell, can't remember, 4,000 or 5,000 tickets for that game. But it was kind of cold and blustery that morning, so that kept a lot of people home. The weather did clear off around lunchtime, and it was still kind of cold and blustery, but it was sunny, and they were able to get the game in. But that did keep a lot of people, especially from out of town, from traveling in and watching the game.
Why was Babe Ruth's tour through the small towns in the Midwest so unusual for the times? We have to remember that St. Louis was the farthest city west in Major League Baseball, so everything past St. Louis, of course, there was no TV, radio was just beginning, so nobody had really seen much about Major League Baseball unless they lived in St. Louis or to the east of St. Louis. So this had to be pretty special for the people out in the hinterlands.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's what was amazing to me, was seeing, reading the stories about some of the people that did get to meet him, and I can't imagine how exhausting it was for those guys. You're coming off of the regular season. You think your body's worn out anyway. Then you're traveling on these bumpy railroad cars, playing baseball. Every town you come to, hey, got to meet the mayor, got to meet the head of the Chamber of Commerce, got to meet whatever. And these guys, especially Babe, was really attached to kids. He loved kids, and he would do a lot of visits to orphanages and hospitals and places like that. So they were doing all that, and then, doing the after the ball game dinner kind of thing, drinking and hobnobbing and all that. And I just can't imagine how exhausting that would have been for them. But you mentioned that, if you wanted to see a ball game, you had to, if you lived in Iowa, let's say you had to hop on a train and go to Chicago or down to St. Louis to see somebody. If you had a car, that doesn't mean the roads were that good. It doesn't mean that your car would have made it that far. There was no TV back then. Radio, there were only 30 radio stations in the country in 1930 or 1920, excuse me. They couldn't really hear the games. The newspapers were pretty much the venue of learning about games and stuff like that, watching the box scores and seeing pictures of Babe. I don't know if the movie theaters, if they would have, sometimes they had like newsreels that they would show before they popped Charlie Chaplin on. They probably had some newsreels of Babe, like especially the World Series or whatever. But it was a big deal for them to come to these little towns, and sometimes they didn't play all that well either. And I think everybody was expecting to plop down a silver dollar to see Babe Ruth, bat 3 times and hit 8 home runs. Well, that ain't going to happen. There's a lot of reasons he might not have that great of a game. Tired, probably hungover. And you got to give some of these small town pitchers credit too. They might have been able to become big major league ball players themselves, but they were out on the farm. They had obligations there, family, whatever. And sometimes you read about guys who are, you think of as being kind of crappy career pitchers, but they could always strike out Al Kaline or whatever too. One newspaper called him Babe Ruth because he didn't deliver very well. So,
what did you learn about Babe Ruth that you didn't know before?
Oh boy!
Or was there more than one thing you learned?
Where to start?
Yeah,
just a lot. I always, had an appreciation for him as a great ball player, but just delving into his background, his upbringing, just coming from the very poorest environment he possibly could. He grew up in Baltimore, born there around 1890, and it was it's the area where the Orioles play baseball now, Camden Yards. His dad ran some bars there in that area. It sounds like it's a really nice area now. I'd love to go there sometime. But back in the day where they were at, there was a little creek that ran through that neighborhood. Up on top of the hill of that creek was a meatpacking plant. And they dumped all their crap in that creek that came past through this neighborhood, dumped into the estuary in Baltimore. And it sounds like that was where the Baltimore sewage would kind of like collect and never really get washed out. So you can imagine how filthy that water was. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad yard was close by, so there was a lot of noise and coal dust and all that. And said that at the time Babe was born, that neighborhood was like a 10% infant mortality rate. And Babe's mom was alcoholic. She had some severe mental issues and never really was that close to Babe. His dad was busy running bars and, kind of abusive, it sounds like, and basically sent him off to this Catholic boys' school. It worked out really good for Babe because he said that a guy named Father Matthias was kind of taught him how to play baseball and also taught him about life, was how Babe phrased it. All worked out good. Babe had a real empathy and understanding for the downtrodden people in society. He loved playing against and with black ball players. That was one of the things that owners he really wanted to become a manager or a coach after he retired, but a lot of owners were afraid that he was going to recruit and sign black baseball players to play for him, which they were not fond of. And actually, blacks didn't play any Major League Baseball until Landis died. So Jackie Robinson in the mid 1940s is your first black baseball player in the modern era. So,
where can people get your book?
It can go to timgroverbooks.com and order it that way directly. Otherwise, like Beaverdale Books in Des Moines carries it, Page Turner Books in Indianola. I also have a blog that I started writing, and it's got stuff not just necessarily, mostly not about baseball. Just it's called Barnstorming Brain. So if you just go, it's a Substack column, but if you go at Barnstorming Brain, that will take you right to it. I write about kind of history and genealogy and just random stuff. I'm writing one right now about called the Jimasota Twins. When the 1960s, the Twins had a lot of really good pitchers named Jim. So I kind of talk about them, Jim Perry, and all of that. So I just have a lot of fun with that and write about what I want. But yeah, timgroverbooks.com. There's another guy named Tim Grover out there, Tim S. Grover. He's a athletic trainer for Michael Jordan and a bunch of other guys out of Chicago. I am not Tim S. Grover. Actually called Timothy Grover on the book.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a fun read. It's a nice Christmas gift. Yeah, it has a lot of pictures. So, and thank you.
Yeah, you bet. I'll tell you my story. I was born in Clarinda. It's a county seat of
I've been to the
Page
Clarinda
County.
A's banquet. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Clarinda A's are pretty famous in baseball circles. Ozzie Smith played there, Von Hayes, Chuck Knobloch, I think others.
Yep.
My grandfather had a factory there for several years, and he made wind chargers, which were the first power source on farms in rural areas in America, were these wind chargers to power their radios before REA came along. They were sold worldwide. Okay. And then he made over 500,000 training rifles in World War II for the Army and Navy.
Wow.
He got an award from the government for efficiency. Registry even went down there and covered it. He got the clipping. I looked at newspapers.com and found the story where the Register went down and covered it, getting this big award from the government. My other grandfather was a dentist down there in the square from 1914 to 1961.
Okay.
Practiced dentistry down there. Let me play in his office. The office was in the upstairs of a 2-story building, so he had to go upstairs to get to his office. A little unusual today. I don't think you'd see that today because it wouldn't be handicap accessible, but I'm surprised I didn't become a dentist, but I didn't. So, but then I went to, after the war, he went to college at Iowa State, finished school there, and I was born in Clarinda, but then we moved to Ames. I did live in Ames. I don't remember anything about it, but we lived in Pamela Court, infamous student housing for mainly veterans after the war and their families. They had all these metal huts. I've seen pictures of them. I think I got pictures of me standing outside the metal hut. No yard to speak of, probably just gravel. But so that's where my dad finished school. Then he got his first job with Alcoa, the aluminum company. He was a mechanical engineer.
Okay.
Kind of took after his dad, and his 2 brothers were also mechanical engineers. So then the first job was outside of Chicago, and that's how I became a Cub fan. Because we lived in River Forest and Wheaton, farther west of Chicago. Started taking me to Cub games, of course, because he'd been a Cub fan. And started going to Cub games in the 50s. Of course, they were terrible then.
Yep.
But they did have Ernie Banks' photo that his son Joey gave me at a fantasy camp, so that worked out well. But then he got transferred to a plant in Indiana, although he drove most of the time to Dayton, Ohio, across the line to work on can-ins for aluminum can-ins for Alcoa. He more or less invented the easy open can-in that you see on can-ins. The first can-ins flip-top tabs.
Really?
So in the 60s, he was going all around to breweries across the U.S. when they had problems with their can lines. He would go troubleshoot, find out what the problem was. He went down to Florida, St. Louis, Milwaukee, Coors out in Colorado, L.A. Any place that had breweries that were having problems, he'd go try to fix the problem. Although he didn't like beer. He would drink other things, but he didn't really like beer, but it made him a living.
Yeah,
so
that's good.
Then he ended up in Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, near the home office. I did go to high school a couple years out there. I didn't like it, so I wanted to get back to Midwest. So I went to Bradley University in Peoria, majored in journalism. And after that, I worked in papers in Ohio, Illinois, and Iowa the last 21 years in Iowa, southeast Iowa, and I was the managing editor of the paper in Keokuk from 1998 to 2014. Retired, then we moved up here to Des Moines because we had 2 daughters and grandkids up here. We still have 1 daughter and 3 grandkids up here. One daughter, 1 grandkid out in Phoenix, Arizona. I ushered for the Iowa Cubs for 6 seasons, 5 before the pandemic, 1 after. That was kind of fun. I got to know people in the front office, especially Sam and Randy Wayhofer. I started out going to write a story for Society for American Baseball Research on the park and the fact that it's the smallest AAA market, yet it's always one of the better attendance-wise, especially when Gardner and his group was owning it. They have 12 years where they drew over 500,000 people, which in minor league baseball, that's kind of the gold standard if you can draw over 500,000 people. And here they're the smallest market in AAA.
Wow.
But Sabre didn't take it, but they suggested putting it on cmeds.com. That original story is on cmeds.com. I think it's still on there. Another baseball website. 16, I interviewed Sam Burnaby in his office this February. And then eventually got this idea to do this book here.
Yep, I read that one. It was good.
And I even did all the layout, arranged the pictures and all that. Because I did have layout skills from newspaper work. That was more focused on just that side of where Principal Park is now, not the whole history of the franchise. But it did give me the bones, at least, for the next book, which is, of course, this one here. Of course, I didn't know that much about the beginning of the franchise. So like you, I went to newspapers.com, did a lot of looking at old newspapers from the late 1800s up through especially the 1980s. They had great sports sections back then before Gannett bought it.
Yeah, they did.
Seg Taylor, of course, very famous, and the field's named after him. Bill Bryson, the older Bill Bryson, was a great sports writer. So did use footnotes. So back the book, it's got there are over 500 footnotes. I wanted to give people credit where I got the information from. if you want to go back to these articles and read the whole article, you can look up all those footnotes, the issue it was in, the title of the story, and whatnot. So,
And maybe I've got your book here too,
yeah.
Steve. Maybe we can talk about that day that Babe Ruth hit 3 home runs in Des Moines, Iowa. I was in
Yeah, Babe. Of course, that's the connection between our books here. Babe brought his tour. He did it at least 2 years that I'm aware of, but
chapter 4, right there in the middle. Yeah,
page 49.
October 27th, 1926. Yeah, Western League Park.
He came to Des Moines on October 6th. They were decent competition, not major league quality, but decent.
I think in 1926 was when he did that. Western League Park, which is where the North High School football field is at now.
Right.
That area, Riverview Park in Des Moines.
Yeah.
Everybody's familiar with that.
It's October 27th. After arriving by train in Des Moines at 8 a.m., he ate breakfast with the Demons president, Lee Kaiser, among others, and visited disabled soldiers in a Knoxville hospital before suiting up for the exhibition game at 2:30 p.m. that day. When he arrived at the hospital by car, he made a short speech to the residents who were able to leave their rooms. Afterwards, Babe visited some of the patients who were bedfast or could not leave their wards, the Des Moines Register reports editor Sec Taylor wrote the next day. Unfortunately, some of them were unable to recognize him, but many did, and apparently enjoyed and appreciated the opportunity to shake the hand and hear the voice of the great baseball player. After skipping lunch, he put on a football uniform and had his picture taken at the ballpark with captains of the Drake University football team.
I saw a picture of that. It's pretty funny.
After changing into a baseball uniform, he hit 3 balls over the outfield fence in batting practice and played in all 9 innings of the exhibition matchup against Dutch Wetzel's All-Stars. The Sultan of the Swats' 3 home runs in the main affair propelled his All-Star team to a 14-19 victory with approximately 2,500 spectators on hand. It didn't take Ruth long to get the range of the farthest corner of the park as he drove 6 balls out of the lot in less than 10 minutes, and all the clouds were terrific liners, the Des Moines Tribune reported.
I think it's interesting, too. You think of, Babe Ruth hit 714 home runs in his career, but there were only 3 times in his major league career that he hit even 3 home runs in a game. He did that here in Des Moines, obviously, in an exhibition game, but the other two of the other times were in the World Series, 2 separate times against the Cardinals, I believe. And the last time was his very, very last game. He hit 3 home runs while playing for the Boston Braves. And all teams, yes. And this was in Pittsburgh, and it was also one of the furthest home runs he ever hit was in his very last game too. So
funny you should mention that, because my uncle, my dad's oldest brother, Howard, who worked for Alcoa too, down in the main office in Pittsburgh, he was at that game. In 35, he saw Babe Ruth hit the home runs. His son, Jack, out in Colorado, a couple of years ago, sent me the note that his dad, Howard, wrote to him. I have that note. I've got it mounted with, he sent a postcard, so I got a postcard plus the note. Then I went online and got some Babe Ruth baseball cards, including one when he was in his prime and one when he was with the Braves. So I put that all together, framed as I got a connection with Babe through my Uncle Howard. the
That's
last
very
home
cool.
runs in Pittsburgh.
That's what that's what I've enjoyed about some of the book appearances, things like that I've done too. I've done some libraries, some bookstores, some civic events, whatnot. But hearing other people's stories about Babe Ruth or whatnot, my favorite one I think I've heard so far was a guy who said that his great great uncle or whatever was in Chicago in the 1920s. He was like kid. He was like 8, 10 years old, walking down the sidewalk, and he saw this bag sitting in front of this house, and he kicked it. Well, and it exploded. Okay, what this was apparently designed to the mayor of Chicago lived in that house. So this was like a attempt to assassinate the mayor basically. So this poor kid is in the hospital in Chicago. He wound up losing an eye. But Babe Ruth, the Yankees were playing in Chicago at the time, and Babe went and visited this kid, signed something for him, and of course it stayed in the family for a while, and then somebody eventually sold it, and hopefully they got the big dollars they deserved for that. But that was just a fascinating story. That's what the fun part about going out and telling people about this book too, is just hearing stuff like that.
And baseball seems to have more stories about it than any other sport that I know of. Maybe because it's been around since, well, the National League
Mhm.
started in 1876, so
Right.
got a lot of history that the other sports don't really have.
Yeah, that's true. Yep.
So I
I
started
think we
writing
forget.
this book in March of 23, came out in December of 23,
Mm-hmm.
and it's got its own website, pugfireballandcompany.com. You can get the book off the website. It's also an Instagram account, a Twitter account, Facebook account. The publisher I went through set up all these social media channels. First time I'm doing podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm trying to download my own podcast on YouTube, so I don't have to pay somebody else thousands of dollars to do it. I got the photos from the book from John Liepp, a
Yeah.
great Iowa
Yeah, we were
baseball
at the
historian.
you and I were at the Sabre event together in
Yeah,
Dubuque last spring
right.
and met John there.
He let me use some of his, including the 1888 team. That's one of his better photos. Yeah, yeah, picture of the team there. Oops.
Oh,
Scott, page 2. That's a picture of the 1888 team.
okay.
Scott Saylor at the Iowa Cubs, he went back to our archives and gave me some that he could find. When you go to the suites, they got team photos of each team, probably going back to at least 47. But
Okay.
some of those are kind of stuck in the frame, and he didn't want to try to pull them out and ruin them.
Mm-hmm.
But he did give me pictures like Mark Grace, Pepper Martin, the 47, 48 team. I went down to the ballpark. I took pictures of their own Hall of Fame. You see the banners up when
Mm-hmm.
you go in of all the players that I think Sam and a couple other people picked out like an all-time Iowa Cubs team.
Yeah, that's cool to
So I
walk
took
in the
those, and then I
billboard
used
see
some
that.
of those
Yeah.
pictures in here. I went down to the State Historical Society, looked at a picture from our magazine, Persinger's Times, like in the late 1800s. It actually had a front page story with photos of each player and bios of each player. They let me look at that and take pictures of a very fancy front page, very flowery, ornate logo to it. You don't see that anymore.
Right.
So I got
Yep.
those together. So then I had somebody out in California, professional, proofread it. It probably took a couple of months going back and forth and agreeing whether those changes were the right things to make. I know one thing we debated was whether to capitalize the B in black. I've seen it both ways. I decided to capitalize it.
Uh-huh.
Because there's a lot of information in here about the Negro. I didn't know the Negro Leagues played so many games in Des Moines. That was new to me.
Oh, I didn't know that either.
And so you'll see a lot of references, and I got those mainly from old Des Moines registers, but I found out about it when they had the Sabre Conference in Chicago. They always do a special booklet of stories from that area of the country. One of those was about the Negro Leagues playing games in Iowa. I found out through that source that they had all these games in Iowa. Davenport had more games than Des Moines did for some reason. But I got the dates from there and then went online to look up newspaper accounts of those games. Bucko and Eo played here. There's an exhibition game between Bob Feller and Satchel Paige. And Feller was still very young. I think he might even been still in high school or this summer after high school, but he was very young.
If I do another baseball book, and I don't know if I will or not, because I know how much work went into doing this, and I've got a couple other things that I really do want to get done, especially like some family genealogy stuff. But I found that after the 1946 season, Feller had come out of World War II, and he knew how to fly airplanes, so he was comfortable with that. But he and Satchel Paige did a barnstorming tour after the 46 season. And these were the first sports teams that traveled by plane. Each of the teams, the Negro League guys and Feller's team, they each had their own plane to fly. But there were a lot of owners that were apprehensive about having, and these were all-star teams too. Feller had several guys that went on to be in the Hall of Fame on his team, and kind of same with Satch. Ted Williams wasn't allowed to play by the Red Sox because Red Sox ownership was afraid the plane was going to crash. Of course, that did not happen, but I think that'd be a fascinating subject to dive deeper into. And if I have the time and ambition, that's, I think, what my next baseball book would be. So,
Feller came here in 51 after the season, pitched in an exhibition game. Of course, he was older by then. He'd had a good year, but he hadn't probably pitched since the season ended, so he was a little rusty. And they hit him pretty hard. But he flew from Cleveland to get here. He stopped in Iowa City to fuel up. Came here.
And flying his own. Wow. Yeah, that's cool.
So, yeah, it was a lot of fun, but a lot of work, as you say.
Another Bob Feller and Babe Ruth trivia thing, too, is that there's that famous Pulitzer Prize winning picture of Babe Ruth when he went to Yankee Stadium. It was his last appearance there, and he had throat cancer, and the recordings of him talking like this, just really bad shape. But he's leaning against a baseball bat. That was Bob Feller's baseball bat he was leaning against. So that's pretty cool too.
I saw that at the Feller Museum in Van Meter before they moved most of the stuff up to Cleveland. Yeah.
I kicked myself that I never made it out there, It's like you always think, okay, well, get out there sometime, and then they closed it down. Used to have some really cool players show up too for sign autographs and stuff like that.
Yeah, when he was alive, especially, Bob would come back and other guys would join him.
Yeah.
But as far as getting my book, you can get it on that website, pugfireballandcompany.com. It's on Amazon. You can get it at Beaverdale Books. You can get it in Tandem. Artists and authors downtown. There's the page turners in Indianola. There's one up in Ames has it. There's one out in Indianola or one out in Altoona. and Ankeny. Oh, West Des Moines, the Barnes & Noble on University, not the one at the mall. They have some too. Like you
Okay.
say, these books would make good Christmas presents for any baseball fan and people's lives. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they're fun. They're fun reading. And even if you're not, I think if people aren't even a hardcore baseball fan, there's still enough history in those books
Just the history
that
alone,
they
yeah.
can learn a lot about that too. I'm kind of drawn to the 1920s as well because that was when my grandparents were first getting married and starting to have kids and all that stuff. And I knew all of my grandparents and close to them. So you just kind of see how history, technology developed during that era within their lifetime. That's pretty cool too. It's a pretty amazing period in history when good roads were starting to get built and farmers were starting to get electricity and telephones and radio and all that stuff was just beginning to emerge.
With the Des Moines franchise, a lot of people are fascinated by the names they've had over the years, like Demons, Hawkeyes, Prohibitionists. I got a Prohibitionist hat that I wore to games in the summer. Undertakers, Champions, Boosters, Politicians, just amazing names back in the day. The newspapers used to have contests, and that's how they would pick the name of the team for the next season, was by a popular vote of fans. I don't think they would do that anymore. But that's how you got all these crazy names from the fans back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They've been pretty steady since, 47 when they brought baseball back to Des Moines. They were the Bruins because they were associated with the Cubs. The A's came in 69. AAA came in 69. The Oaks, after the oak tree.
Yeah.
Because the oak tree had been made the state tree of Iowa around that time.
Okay.
They were also
plus they were the Oakland A's as well.
A's
so
too. But then, but then, see, 81, they became a property of the Cubs, but they were still the Oaks for 1 year. Then they've been the Iowa Cubs ever since 82.
Weren't they associated with the White Sox for a
White
year
Sox
or two?
for a while. Houston 1 year, the White Sox.
Okay.
They had a lot of great players come through here in the 70s, especially with Oakland, Vida Blue, Joe Rudy, Gene Tennis, George Hendrick. They played a lot of exhibition games with the parent club back then. They don't do that anymore, but those, all the ones I was aware of could find, I've written about in the book. There's even an exhibition game between Cleveland and San Francisco, even though neither had any ties to Des Moines, but that was the late 50s, I think. So guys like Rocky Colavito, Willie Mays, William McCovey, Lepeta, were in Des Moines playing baseball.
Wow.
Even though they weren't affiliated with, that's in the book too, so.
I know. This has been a lot of fun. I appreciate the chance to be on here with you, Steve, and swap stories. Hopefully the people watching this are going to learn a few things. You can email me to timggrover@gmail.com or go to the website for the book, timgroverbooks.com. And my Substack column is at Barnstorming Brain. We'll turn on Barnstorming Babe. So, but thank you very much, Steve.
You bet. See ya.